Carbon credits. You've heard the term thrown around everywhere, right? In the news, in companies' sustainability reports, pretty much any time people are debating climate change. But what are they, really? And the big question, do they actually work? Okay, let's get into it and break this whole thing down.
First, let's just get a sense of scale. I want you to look at this number, 40 billion tons. That is roughly how much carbon dioxide we, as a species, pump into the atmosphere every single year. It's a mind-boggling number. And a problem that big, well, it demands some pretty big solutions. And that's exactly where the whole idea of carbon credits comes from.
So, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the carbon challenge itself. Then we'll define what a carbon credit actually is. We'll trace its journey from a real-world project to a company's balance sheet, dive into the huge debate around them, and finally take a peek at what the future might hold.
All right, so let's start with the core problem. Every company, every single industry leaves a carbon footprint, and there's this immense global pressure building up to hit climate targets. That means companies have to either slash their emissions or figure out a way to compensate for them. And that pressure, that need to compensate, leads us straight to the proposed solution. But before we get into the weeds, we gotta answer the most basic question of all. What even is a carbon credit?
At its most basic, a carbon credit is a certificate that stands for 1 ton of CO2. Now, in some mandatory systems, it's literally a permit that allows a company to emit that ton, but what we usually hear about is the voluntary market. In that world, a credit is proof that 1 ton of CO2 has been prevented from entering the atmosphere, or even better, removed from it. The whole idea is to put a price on pollution and create a real financial value for cleaning it up.
Here's a really simple way to think about it, especially for the voluntary credits. Just picture it as a receipt. A company buys this receipt to prove they've paid for 1 ton of CO2 to be cleaned up somewhere else in the world, which balances out 1 ton of their own pollution. Simple concept, right? On paper, anyway.
But these receipts, they don't just magically appear. They have a whole life cycle. They're born from actual on-the-ground projects. And if you want to understand how this market works and where it can go wrong, you have to understand that journey.
So how is a credit actually born? Well, it happens in about 4 steps. First, you've got the project itself. Somebody decides to plant a huge forest or build a wind farm, something that cuts down on carbon. Second, and this part is absolutely crucial, an independent auditor has to come in and verify that the project is real and that it's reducing as much CO2 as it claims. Once that's confirmed, a registry issues a unique credit for every single ton saved. And finally, a company that needs to offset its emissions goes and buys that credit on the market. Now that sounds pretty straightforward, but trust me, each of those steps is loaded with potential problems.
And those problems bring us right to the heart of the great debate. Because while the idea sounds so clean and simple, the reality is messy. It's really, really controversial. So are these things a genius tool or just a dangerous loophole?
This really lays out the two sides of the coin. The promise, the big idea, is that these credits can funnel billions of dollars into green projects that would never get funded otherwise. Think renewable energy in developing countries. That's a huge win. But the peril? It's the risk of greenwashing. When a company just buys cheap, sketchy credits so they can say they're carbon neutral without actually changing how they operate. And then there's this giant headache called additionality. Basically, it asks, would this forest have been protected anyway? If the answer is yes, then buying the credit didn't add any climate benefit at all. And figuring that out, it's incredibly difficult. So where does all this leave us? On the one hand, you've got this really powerful idea, a market-based tool to fix a global problem. But on the other hand, you have these massive, real-world challenges in making it work properly. The entire future of carbon credits really hinges on whether we can solve those problems.
Okay, so let's boil this all down. What are the main things to walk away with? First, carbon credits are just one tool in a very big toolbox. They are not a silver bullet solution. Second, their entire value, their effectiveness, depends completely on rigorous, high-quality verification. Without trust, the whole system just falls apart. Third, love them or hate them, they are a massive part of the global climate conversation right now. And finally, if you want to understand what big companies are doing about sustainability, you just have to understand how this market works.
Which brings us to the final big question to leave you with. As we try to tackle that 40 billion ton problem we started with, are carbon credits a vital, necessary tool to help us get there, or are they just a dangerous distraction, letting us feel good while we delay the hard, fundamental changes we really need to make? It's something to think about.